Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a short story writer, poet, filmmaker, and screenplay writer. His short story collection is called City Swimmers. He has written poetry in both the English and Spanish languages, and he has written for 3 feature films. His name is Steve Clark, and my interview with Steve will follow the note-taking sounds. Steve Clark, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. My name is Steve Clark. I'm a New York-based writer, painter, and filmmaker. And I just come out with a short story collection called City Swimmers and Other Stories. And just excited to be on your podcast.
You mentioned your short story collection, which is titled City Swimmers and Other. What was the last word in that title?
Oh, and Other Stories.
And City Swimmers and Other Stories. Without spoiling too much of your short story collection, how many stories are in the collection, and is there a common theme of the collection?
So there are 10 short stories in there. There wasn't an intentional theme when I started writing it, but looking back on it, there are certain themes of marriage, having children, living in New York. It's a very urban New York collection of short stories. I was born in New York, and I guess my imagination pulled from that source a lot, because almost all the stories take place in New York, except for one which takes place in Paris. But even in that one, the protagonist of the story, the main character, does recall certain aspects of New York. So I do think of it as a very urban, New York-based contemporary collection of short stories.
Another book you've written is called Music and Scars, and according to your website, those are excerpts of an unpublished manuscript. Without spoiling too much of that book, can you tell our listeners more about it?
Sure. So to back up, before that, I wrote a book of poems called From the Ashes, which was published in Spain bilingually in about 2010, I think. And so that was the first collection of poetry that I wrote, poetry was really my first sort of creative step forward when I was about 19. So that was my first book of poems. And that collection, which is really just an excerpt, is from an unpublished manuscript that will probably come out in the next year or so, called Music and Scars. And that is just another collection of poems, and it's sort of a interrelated theme. Again, there's a lot of New York, but it's a little bit less grounded in characters and plot line than my short story collection.
You mentioned Desde, las cenizas, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that's your poetry collection that translates into, whose title translates into From the Ashes. And you've also written the poetry collection Notes. Without spoiling too much of those 2 poetry collections, how many poems are in each collection, and are there common themes to each of the collections?
So From the Ashes, well, it was reviewed in Spain. It was called something like an apocalyptic love poem to nobody, and sort of to oneself or to an anonymous unknown lover. And that was a very thorough and interesting review by a Spanish poet critic called James Siles, and that appeared in the ABC Cultural of Spain. And he described it like that, and I think that is one way to describe that very surreal, part gritty, part surreal love poem. And it's sort of it's kind of a love poem to the city. It's a love poem to an unknown lover, and it takes part in again, which I'm just realizing now, that's also in 10 parts. So those could be considered 10 separate poems, but they certainly are related in tone and atmosphere, and sort of in the there's kind of a quiet or gruff mysticism to it, because you don't know who the person is referring to, or who the poet is addressing in the poem. So that's From the Ashes, which your pronunciation's good, Desde las cenizas. And the other sort of short book of poems is called Notes, and that was really a collection of unpublished manuscripts, or sort of poems from some uncollected manuscripts. And those aren't as related. Those are just sort of poems that I plucked out of different collections of poems that I put together over the years, and I put them in this little. It's more of almost like a art pamphlet, because it was done to accompany a painting exhibition that I had in New York, and the curator of that exhibit wanted to place some poems of mine alongside the artwork, because that painting exhibition was called Black Notes, and or just Notes actually. So we took some poems from the different manuscripts and put them together in a little manuscript, and that's what you have in that very thin, I couldn't even call it a volume, but thin sort of scattering or spattering of poems.
Your mother wrote a Spanish language poetry collection, Atisbos, which you translated into English. What is your mother's poetry collection about, and has your mother's poetry influenced your own?
Well, she has influenced me very much because she is Spanish. She was born in Madrid. She came to the States when she was 17 or 18 on a scholarship, and she stayed and became kind of a New Yorker after her divorce from my father, and stayed here until she was about 50, when she was a photographer and she won the Grand Prix of Rome photography prize. Moved to Rome, and then fell in love, and eventually moved back to Spain to be with our family, my mother's side anyway. And she's always been a poet. She's always written poetry. She started publishing quite late in life, when she was in her 50s, and now has about 10 or 11 collections of poems, one of which won the Madrid Best Poetry Award for books of poetry. And so I am lucky in the sense that we have a similar sensibility. So when I published my book in Spain, she translated my book, which I wrote in English, into Spanish. So that was published bilingually. And so I returned the favor, if you could call it that, that labor of love, which is translation, for her latest book of poems, which is called Atisbos, which translates roughly into glimpses. And she has a different style of poetry. Mine has a little bit of more New York grit in it. Hers is a little bit more resonant, mystical, very beautiful, and but they're different. But there's a certain dialogue between them, I would say.
What is your best advice to aspiring poetry and short story writers who want to write published poetry and or short story collections for the first time?
Well, I would just say follow and read everything that you really love, not necessarily what other people like or anything, to really find what you love in literature. And it might not be what other people like, but those books will lead you to other books, which will lead you to other books, which will somehow reverberate within yourself. And if you really want to do it, it will push you into your own voice in a weird way. And so I think that the only kind of poetry and short stories to write really are the ones that please you. So I think young writers often tend to fall in the trap of trying to impress other people and write what they think they should be writing. And I think the journey of a writer is to really to arrive to a place where you're really only concerned with giving yourself really deep, utter joy with the work that you do, but being honest with yourself and knowing whether it is, worthwhile for other people to read as well. But I do believe if you really write something very honestly, that you really love yourself, you get deep enough in yourself that you get to a universal place that other people, maybe many, maybe few, will also relate to it. And when you get there, I think the publications and sending it out and finding the publishers, that sort of ends up coming to you somehow, or it ends up getting done at a certain point. Maybe sooner for some people, maybe later. But that's sort of a secondary aspect to this thing, because in the end of the day, the only real payment is kind of the pleasure you get in doing it and the pleasure you get in feeling that you've done something that you can be proud of, that you're still happy with after a couple weeks or more.
Are all your books independently, traditionally, or hybrid published, or did you use different publishing methods for each of your books?
Well, my first Spanish book was published by a traditional publisher in Spain called Huerga y Fierro. They did a great job with the book. And I have another book coming out in late May, which is an unusual joint memoir. You brought up my mother, that I actually wrote with my mother as a correspondence over the last year and a half. And that's being published by a traditional publisher called Lapis Lazuli, a great publisher in Spain that we absolutely love. And then so since I have a foreign publisher with a short story collection put together with a few people, an independent publishing house, which put out City Swimmers and other stories, and that publishing house is called Black Note Press, and we're going to be publishing some other books from that. So I'd say it's kind of a hybrid, but mostly with traditional publishers as the foundation.
The next couple of questions I have are about your work as a filmmaker. You've written, directed, and produced 3 feature films: The Last International Playboy, Night Has Settled, and An Actor Prepares. What are each of your films about?
Wow. Okay, so the first one I directed, The Last International Playboy, was about a guy who seemed to have everything, who finds out that the love of his life is going to marry someone else, and it sends him to a crisis, which he's drawn out by a wonderful, magical sort of neighbor she's 11 years old, and she was played by a wonderful actress named India Nenga. So it's about his sort of voyage into growing up. He was kind of a Peter Pan-like figure. The second one, Night Is Settled, is an independent New York film, and it's really about growing up in the 80s. It's very autobiographical. It's about a kid who's 13 who's growing up at a very different time, and he's struggling with the departure of really the maternal figure in his life, who isn't his mother, but the woman who is taking care of him, and she's moving back to Chile. So this spirals him into a kind of depression, and this depression exists alongside with, sort of rites of passage at that time anyway, which were gone through at a lot younger ages, like alcohol and losing your virginity and stuff like that, with a 1980s backdrop of New York. So that's what Night Is Settled is about. And An Actor Prepares is a road trip father-son movie. The father is played by Jeremy Irons. The son is played by Jack Houston. And this is a sort of a more comedic road trip movie with a father and son, and basically a son who really hates his father and even testified against his father in his parents' divorce, because his father's a world-famous actor, alcoholic, womanizer, and the son is more of a modern. He teaches feminist studies at Berkeley, and they do not get along, but they're forced to do a road trip to make it to the son's sister's wedding. So that is a comedy road trip. So those are the 3 films that I've written, directed, and produced.
Which part of filmmaking do you enjoy most? Screenwriting, directing, or producing, and why?
I love sitting down and writing a film because you're having such fun putting together the jigsaw puzzle structure of it. And it's just such a wonderful experience to write it. And I love writing dialogue. So that experience is really fun and energetic and a wonderful mental exercise. Directing is great for a very different reason, that you're working with these incredible, talented actors who always shock you with what they bring, and their wonderful dedication. And you feel that, especially with the independent filmmaking, that you're sort of trying to do something impossible for very little money, very little time, and you feel almost that you're breaking the law and getting it done. at sort of this breakneck speed, but you're taking time to try and create art within that framework. That's all wonderful. Producing, I do not like at all. Producing for me is a nightmare. It's dealing with contracts and negotiations and selling it and marketing. And that for me is 100% the least enjoyable part of the process because it's just it's basically putting out fires left, right, and center. And I'd love to not be producing the film, just writing and directing, which I am doing for a movie that hopefully will be shooting in June, if not in September, which is called Sweet 16. And so it's hopefully we're heading into a direction where the focus can be more concentrated on the artistic part of making the film.
As an artistic painter, how many paintings have you created and what styles of paintings do you produce?
Wow, I don't know how many paintings I've produced. I've been painting since I was about 19. Um, I I grew up going to the Whitney and to the Met, seeing the Franz Kleins, the Mark Rothkos, the Pollocks. I always loved the Cy Twombly's and the Spanish artist Tapias is one whom I love a lot. So I'm more of in the abstract expressionist sort of school, and but I don't see myself as that totally because I'm not. I will do figurative stuff as well, and I work with any kinds of material. I work on paper. I work on canvas. I work on wood. I work with oils. I work with charcoal, house paints, acrylics, and I just like to go into my studio and have a place with absolutely no rules and surprise myself with what I'm going to do. It's just another aspect of sort of pleasure because you sort of just want to make things that you eventually end up liking or at least being able to live with.
Is there anything in common that motivates you to create written works, films, and paintings?
I don't know what it is that's in common with them except for a compulsion to do all of them. That's probably the common denominator because they're very different endeavors. There's the wonderful quietness of sitting in your room or wherever and writing a poem, which is very solitary. It's not a communal activity. And then there's the great aspect of creating art together or collaborating with someone on a film, and then going back again and sort of working with paints and charcoals and canvases and materials to make a painting. So I don't really know what the common thread. The common thread is probably just the compulsion and the need to want to do them.
Steve, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest.
Thank you, Aaron. It was a real pleasure, and I really appreciate it.
That was a wonderful interview, and I thank Steve for appearing on this podcast. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.